The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. I was sick, sick unto death with that long agony, and when they at length unbound me, and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from its association in fancy with the burr of a mill wheel. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. Yet for a while I saw, but with how terrible an exaggeration! I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me white, whiter than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and thin even to grotesqueness, thin with the intensity of their expression of firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern contempt of human torture. I saw that the decrees of what to me was fate were still issuing from those lips. I saw them writhe with a deadly locution. I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. I saw, too, for a few moments of delirious horror, the soft and nearly imperceptible waving of the sable draperies which enwrapped the walls of the apartment, and then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first they wore the aspect of charity, and seemed white and slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill as if I had touched the wire of a galvanic battery, while the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. And then there stole into my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, and it seemed long before it attained full appreciation. But just as my spirit came at length properly to feel and entertain it, the figures of the judges vanished, as if magically from before me. The tall candles sank into nothingness. Their flames went out utterly. The blackness of darkness supervened. All sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad rushing descent as of the soul into Hades. Then silence and stillness, night were the universe. I had swooned, but still will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained I will not attempt to define or even to describe, yet all was not lost. In the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave all is not lost. Else there is no immortality for man. Arousing from the most profound of slumbers, we break the gossamer web of some dream. Yet in a second afterward, so frail may that web have been, we remember not that we have dreamed. In the return to life from the swoon there are 2 stages. First, that of the sense of mental or spiritual. Secondly, that of the sense of physical existence. It seems probable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we could recall the impressions of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond. And that gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? But if the impressions of what I have termed the first stage are not, at will, recalled, yet after long interval, do they not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they come? He who has never swooned is not he who finds strange palaces and wildly familiar faces in coals that glow, is not he who beholds floating in mid-air the sad visions that the many may not view, is not he who ponders over the perfume of some novel flower. Is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the meaning of some musical cadence which has never before arrested his attention? Amid frequent and thoughtful endeavors to remember, amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of seeming nothingness into which my soul had lapsed, there have been moments when I have dreamed of success. There have been brief, very brief periods when I have conjured up remembrances which the lucid reason of a later epoch assures me could have had reference only to that condition of seeming unconsciousness. These shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures that lifted and bore me in silence down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me at the mere idea of the interminableness of the descent. They tell also of a vague horror at my heart on account of that heart's unnatural stillness. Then comes a sense of sudden motionlessness throughout all things, as if those who bore me had reached the innermost recesses of a dungeon of the Inquisition. It was the prostrating apathy of despair. I am not sure that I can say whether it was night or day. Such was the utter darkness that I could not even distinguish the walls of the prison. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the silence appalling. I dared not move. I could scarcely breathe. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I cautiously moved forward, with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was black as the midnight. The distance I had traversed must have been long, for I could not help supposing that I had circumscribed some 30 or 40 yards. At length I stumbled and fell. My chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my face touched something moist and slippery. I reached forward and shuddered as I found it to be slime. At the same moment, my head slipped and I fell forward into the abyss. Had I not been stopped by the edge of the pit, I should have been hurled into its depths. My outstretched arm fell heavily upon the edge, and I shuddered as I withdrew it from the slimy substance that clung to its surface. It was the doom which had been prepared for me. The pit, typical of hell, and regarded by rumor as the ultima thule of all their punishments. To the inquisitors it was the most hideous of fates. I trembled and I shuddered, for the sudden discovery had nearly proved my destruction. Exhausted, I sank back upon the cold floor, and I remembered nothing more until I awoke to find bread and water placed within my reach. The act of charity reassured me. They did not mean to let me perish of hunger, and thus I was still reserved for torments more terrible than those of starvation. A deep sleep fell upon me, and upon awakening I found myself stretched upon a low framework of wood. To my horror I discovered I was bound by a long strap resembling a surcingle. It passed in many convolutions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and my left arm to such an extent that I might reach the food placed near. I saw, to my astonishment, a painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented, save that, in lieu of a scythe, he held a huge pendulum of glittering steel, whose downward motion, though slow, was inexorable. Down, steadily down it crept. I watched it for many long minutes, its movement imperceptible but relentless. It was a crescent-shaped blade, razor-sharp, and as it swung side to side, each vibration brought it lower. I knew that it must eventually pass directly across my heart. At length, a wild hope flashed into my mind. The rats! They swarmed in countless numbers about me, wild, ravenous, and fearless. They had already gnawed at the bandage of my food. With frantic energy, I rubbed the oily remnants of the viand upon the strap that bound me. The hungry vermin sprang eagerly to the scent. They gnawed, they swarmed, they tore at the leathern bonds with their sharp teeth. I writhed in an agony of hope and dread, watching the pendulum descend inch by inch while the creatures labored. At last, with a final convulsive effort, I burst from my bonds. I rolled aside, just as the descending steel swept the spot where I had lain. But my deliverance from the pendulum only prepared me for new torments. Scarcely had I escaped when the infernal machinery was withdrawn. The pendulum was drawn up. I cast my eyes around the dungeon. The walls, previously motionless, began slowly to close in upon me. They glowed with the most intense heat, fiery and metallic. A suffocating vapor filled the air. Step by step, the walls pressed closer, driving me irresistibly toward the yawning pit. Down, steadily down it crept. I took a frenzied pleasure in contrasting its downward with its lateral velocity. To the right, to the left, far and wide, with the shriek of a damned spirit. To my heart with the stealthy pace of the tiger. I alternately laughed and howled as the one or the other idea grew predominant. Down, certainly, relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously, to free my left arm. It was free, only my left, but my bonds were surcingle-like. They bound me round the waist and arms, yet I was free only partially. And now only for a few moments did I pause. I gasped and struggled. At length, a thought struck me. The rats! The vermin which swarmed upon the floor of the dungeon. I had seen them many times, gnawing and struggling about the bandage which confined me. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited for me to die. With more than human resolution, I loosened the remains of the oily and spicy viand that still lay beside me, and I rubbed it upon the bandages where the pendulum was to descend. They leaped upon it avidly, and then, as if for my deliverance, they swarmed up in countless numbers. They gnawed, they clung, they tore. With a movement almost convulsive, the strap gave way. Free! I was free! I sprang aside just as the crescent of steel swept over me, grazing my flesh with its fearful edge. Scarcely had I escaped when the infernal machinery withdrew. The pendulum ceased its descent and was drawn upward into the ceiling. I cast my eyes around the dungeon. The walls, that had seemed motionless, now glowed with a fiery luster. They moved, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but soon with rapid strides, pressing inward from every side. Their heated surface sent forth suffocating vapors. The air grew hot, stifling, and oppressive. Step by step I was driven back, closer and closer, toward the center, toward the very brink of the pit. I shrieked, I struggled, but in vain. There was no escape. The fiery walls hemmed me in. My soul grew sick with despair as I tottered upon the very edge. One step more, and I should have been plunged into the abyss. Then, in that moment of uttermost horror, there came a sound, a human shout, resounding trumpets, harsh voices of command. The fiery walls trembled, reeled back. An outstretched arm seized mine as I fell, fainting into the abyss. It was that of General Lassalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. You have heard the whispers, but the darkness is never silent. Return again, and let the shadows find you. Subscribe, if you dare,